Hi, my name is Burçe Çelik, and I'm a professor of politics and history of communications at Loughborough University, London, and I lead the AHRC funded research project titled Coloniality and Communications, British Telecommunications in Mesopotamia in the early 20th century. I'm working on this project together with Sebastian James Rose and Sena Başöz. Sebastian is a historian with a PhD in history of technology, and Sena is an artist based in London. So this project takes an interdisciplinary approach, bringing together media and communication studies, Middle Eastern studies, and history. We examine the role of British communication networks in shaping Mesopotamia as a colonial space in the early 20th century. By studying these networks, our aim is to uncover the colonial past of communication systems, and in doing so, we hope to contribute to a broader understanding of communications networks, technologies, and practices today, one that is more inclusive and diverse. So why does the history of communication networks matter for understanding media today? It matters because history informs theory. Many of our core ideas about media, the connection between communication networks, democracy, and public debate, are grounded in particular historical experiences. We assume media provides the space where people can listen to one another, deliberate, and hopefully understand each other. And that assumption shapes how we theorize the relationship between journalism, media, and democracy. And crucially, these theories are usually derived from one case, Britain. Moreover, history of infrastructures and networks inform the material foundations of networks that we have today. Telegraph lines, submarine cables, and wireless stations built in the 19th and 20th centuries produced the foundations of our interconnected age and the inequalities in connectivity. Here is the problem. British history is usually reduced to its domestic history, while its imperial and colonial dimensions are overlooked. This reflects a Eurocentric tradition of history writing, one that also shapes media and communication studies. As a result, modern media history is usually told from the perspective of the colonial centers rather than the colonial margins. The underlying assumption is that media history was driven by the West, with little acknowledgement of the role or experience of the non-West. So, why focus on British networks in Mesopotamia? Well, Britain was central to global communications in the 19th and early 20th centuries, yet its imperial role is largely absent from media histories. Looking at colonial context helps us both decolonize Westcentric theories and understand Britain's role as one of the leading imperial powers in building global networks. Britain's global telegraph system stretched across continents, creating channels of connectivity, control, and power, binding the world together in ways that, in some respects, anticipated today's global internet. And Mesopotamia, what the British called the region at the time, was especially important. Its communications history is almost entirely unknown. At the turn of the 20th century, Mesopotamia referred to a vast region, southeast Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iraqi Kurdistan, parts of today's Saudi Arabia. Formerly, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, but as the empire declined, Britain, France, and Germany competed for influence over the space. For Britain, Mesopotamia was a vital communications link between London and South Asian colonies like India. And communications meant, at the time in 19th century, not only information networks, but also transport infrastructures and the control of routes. From the early 1900s to the 1930s, Mesopotamia was transformed into the nation-state of Iraq. Its borders were drawn by imperial powers, and in the 1920s it became a British mandate under the League of Nations. Mandate was a new form of colonial rule. To investigate the role of communications in Mesopotamia, I started the archival research across Britain, the British Telecom Archives, the National Archives at Kew, the British Library, the Museum of Global Communications in Cornwall, and later the Royal Air Force Museum collections in London. When I began, I expected to find primarily terrestrial networks, landed networks like telegraphs, telephony, wired infrastructures. But the archives pointed me elsewhere. Much of the colonial communications infrastructure in Mesopotamia was militarized and aerial rather than landed. So the archives took me from the ground to the air. Militarization wasn't entirely surprising. Many modern and historical communication systems like the internet or telegraph have military roots, especially in imperial counterinsurgency campaigns or what used to be called small wars. But I hadn't anticipated that the main communications infrastructure in Iraq during the Mandate years would be airborne.
My name is Sebastian James Rose. I'm a historian of technology and empire. My research is focused on the history of telecommunications, labour and race, particularly in the Middle East in the late 19th and early 20th century. When I became involved in the project, I began my research in the British Library and the National Archive, expecting to find the ways that the terrestrial telegraph networks were connected and extended under British rule following the establishment of the Mandate of Mesopotamia after the First World War. But I soon discovered that because the RAF was given such a central role in the administration and the defense of Mesopotamia in the 1920s, communication networks were focused skywards. The airborne communication networks consisted of assembling airplanes, workers, air bases into an interconnected airborne system linked by wireless telegraphy and radio. The more documents I read about the establishment and maintenance of these different components of the network, the more I began to understand that it was transnational, or at least contained within the areas of the Middle East and beyond that the British either directly or indirectly ruled. Air bases and wireless communication networks linked semi-autonomous states like Egypt and Iran to British Mandate territories in Palestine, Transjordan and Mesopotamia, and of course with Britain and their most prized colony, India.
Another discovery was that these aerial networks were not confined to Mesopotamia's borders or Iraq's borders. They stretched across Britain's Mandate territories, linking Iraq, Palestine, and what used to be called Transjordan, while connecting to Egypt, Malta, and ultimately the imperial metropole in London. The main actor in this colonial aerial network was the Royal Air Force. I first came across RAF documents at the British Telecom Archives, then traced them to RAF collections. A report titled RAF, Assuming Control in Iraq, tells the whole story. The RAF became the world's first autonomous aerial institution after World War I, largely because of its role in the empire, especially in the Middle East. While aerial policing was first tested in Somaliland in the early 1900s, it was institutionalized in Iraq and refined later in Palestine. Historians like Priya Satya and David Omisi have studied RAF policing, aerial policing, but their accounts largely overlook the communicative dimension. And our project shows that these aerial infrastructures were not just military tools, they were also communication systems. So this insight matters because many of today's communication systems, like I said earlier, satellites, GPS, Wi-Fi, even drones are skyborne, and our research traces these airborne networks back to their colonial roots in repression, counterinsurgency, and policing. This is how we arrive at the concept of air as colonial media.
Britain colonized the air, transforming it into a medium of colonial control and violence. But the British were also concerned with the spectacle of air power, the way in which power from the air could be displayed and communicated to the native population. We might think of these two aspects of British air power, the colonization of air through the building of a network and its control and organization through spectacles of air power, as air as colonial media. Underpinning British conceptions of air as colonial media was a racialized logic that saw the native populations of the Middle East as particularly susceptible to the spectacle of the aircraft. British officials and the leadership of the RAF believed that the aircraft would act as a preemptive policing tool, frightening the native population into compliance. They believed that the aircraft was to the native population of the Middle East a totem of British scientific and technological prowess, power and prestige, a symbol of hierarchical technological progress of the colonizer that could strike remote villages and surveil activity across the country from above. The British hoped to create what they called a moral effect on the native population, a panoptic form of control that sought to enforce self-policing through the idea that every native believed that he was being watched from the skies by a white man. The networking of air and its transformation into colonial media in this sense provided the function of surveillance, spectacle, transmission, and destruction.
And by recovering the colonial histories of communication networks, we can tell a fuller story of media and modernity, one that recognizes both the centers of empire and its margins. This reshapes not only how we understand the past, but also how we think about communication in the present and how we might reimagine it in more inclusive and diverse ways for the future.